I think it's maybe helpful for me to introduce myself as well, so that you know my background and a bit of well, most people ask me, how did you end up in Athens? I think that's mostly the question that I get. But basically, before I came to Athens, I worked in Berlin for about 10 years. I'm not German myself, I'm actually Dutch. I was raised on a very small island in the Caribbean called Saint Martin. For those of you that like airplanes, you may know what island I'm speaking of. But yeah, I started working in startups in Berlin about 10 years ago. I joined a very small startup there as, let's say, the 25th employee. And in 2 years, we grew it to about 250 employees with 20 offices worldwide. And we were then acquired by dunnhumby, a Tesco company in the UK. And at the same time, I was actually headhunted by a big e-commerce player in the US called Wayfair, which sells home goods, so any furniture or anything as such. And Wayfair was looking to expand in Europe. They had a very small office, again, about 25 people in Berlin, and a very small office in the UK, and they wanted to expand. So they asked me to set up their HR operations, similar to what I did at the previous company, which I did. And after 5.5 years, we grew it to about 2,500 people in Europe, with call centers, warehouses, a large 1,000 people tech team in Berlin. And then I decided to leave. And I decided to leave because my husband is Greek. He's from Athens. He's a software engineer himself. And we decided that at some point we would like to move back to his hometown. So that was sometime in the making. I then joined a remote first company before everybody else went remote because of the pandemic, called Hotjar. And I stayed there until my maternity leave, and decided after the maternity leave not to return back to the remote working environment, so to speak, even though everybody was. Basically, I decided on that because I felt that to integrate myself more in the community here, I thought it would be better to join a more local company. And that's how I reached out after my son was 6 months, now 1.5 years. Around this time, actually, I reached out to George at Marathon and said, have you thought of having HR in your portfolio? He said yes. I thought he was joking, but we had a talk, and later on I saw in their business plans that they were serious about having HR in their portfolio. So that was really great for me. On top of that, of course, I mentioned also to George that for me, community building was very important. And I think that's something that's very important to Marathon itself as well, which is why, well, we're obviously sitting here today, but also why we release the reports that we do release. So when I came with the idea of, setting up a report on compensation, of course, we all thought, well, how is this going to pan out? Because here comes somebody who nobody knows and is going to ask people randomly for their compensation. So I think George and I made a little bet that, maybe I would be able to achieve 15 companies. In the end, we almost doubled that amount, and the interest was almost even double of that amount. So yeah, it was quite surprising how many people wanted to participate, or companies wanted to participate. And the way I did that was I said, look, you will give me your compensation, and George and Kostas, your companies participated. So I'm pretty sure you know some of the background of how that went, or those conversations. But I said, in return for your data, you will receive a more detailed report, which is what the companies received. As a side note to that, I also mentioned that, we would also release an external report, which is what every one of you would have read, that was posted on our blog. And this was mostly to make sure that people are understanding a bit better the market, to understand, the attractiveness of also startups and why to join a startup. I think for the majority of people that I still speak to, even here, or even Greeks abroad, that they mentioned they would like to work for one of the big corporates. So, and one of the reasons for that was also compensation, that the compensation they thought for startups was much, much lower. So that's also where a little bit my thinking came to say, let's start with a report like this. I think that if we can at least understand what the market is, then we can go from there to understand, okay, what kind of, compensation strategy should we set up for each of our companies? So that's where this report and where the idea, I would say, came from. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, obviously, the methodology behind it, how we went about it. And what I would actually encourage, if you have questions in between, just to ask the questions as we go. I think that's better than leaving everything towards the end. That way we can kind of address them as we go through. So I would also like to go through the post with you. So I'll share my screen so that we can talk through the pieces. And if you have questions, you can, of course, ask me those. I will say that, of course, there was a benefit to companies in participating. And one of the benefits was that they got a more detailed report. So I also will uphold some of that, as saying that, there's certain detail that I obviously cannot disclose with you as well. Just because I think that's also fairness, but I'd love to talk a little bit more in depth about things that I can talk about. So yeah, you can ask me questions as we go as well. Yeah. Any questions so far?
I have a couple of questions that I'll just post in the chat from Mario Snoutsos from Finloop. Most of us here know him, that he couldn't participate, but he emailed them. So maybe you can decide when to address them.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so I think I'll just share my screen and share the report so that we can go through it together. And as you have questions while we go through it, feel free to shoot them to me, and I will also try to keep an account of if I can see them.
So the one question is if we have any data on salaries and options for the business focused roles, and it's a question that I'm sure will come up more. So like sales, business development, customer support, marketing, even finance, actually. So this is a question that many of us might have. So I'll just address it up front.
Yeah, great. Actually, I think it would be great to maybe answer that right away, because it is part of the methodology, or it has to do with the methodology behind things as well. So the reason why at the moment I decided to only focus on tech roles, to be quite transparent on that, one was because I think the tech roles are the ones that we see being asked a lot, or that I'm asked a lot about, what's the right compensation. It's the one that I think, one of the few that we see that's extremely hard to fill. And so I decided, I think it would be best for us to focus on that first, and then we could go from there. The second reason for not doing more than that at the moment is just purely my own bandwidth. Of course, I'm supporting also our companies, and doing the rest of the job. So being able to do this together with that would just be too big of a job for me to handle right at the first get-go. Having said that, there's a lot of lessons that I obviously learned from doing this first initial report. And you can imagine, I had over 10,000 data points, and there was quite a lot of cleanup that needed to be done as well. So this is why I think there were some great learnings that we can probably use for the coming year to kind of look at, okay, how could we broaden this? So how can we include more areas of the business? For example, maybe more the commerce side, the marketing side, HR, finance, etc., whilst also including tech, and how can we try to scale that more for the coming years? So that's a challenge that I'm going to dig into a little bit more deeper at the beginning of next year. I already have some thoughts on that, and how we can likely scale that more, so that we can try to release a second report next year as well. Yeah. Okay. So if we go through the report itself, basically what I'd love to kind of talk through is what I mentioned, the kind of the methodology. So surveying 27 companies. I reached out to probably, I would say, over 60 companies or so. I'd say about 10 of them I didn't receive any response of at all. There was one company out of all companies that said no, and the rest of the companies were all interested or showed interest. So we had probably about 45 companies, I think, that showed interest. I think about 15 that didn't respond, 45 companies that showed interest and said, yes, we'd like to participate. Of that 45, I'd say probably about 10 then afterwards didn't respond anymore once we had initiated the first conversation. And then I would say we had 27 that ended up in the end really participating and submitting the data. The rest, which was probably about 15 or so more companies, they did not participate mainly for a couple of reasons. One was they didn't have the time to the bandwidth to do that. It was a bit towards end of year, of course, busy period for everyone. And there were a few others that even when we were at the later stage and they were given all of the information to fill out, they never responded. So I followed up a few times, but in the end, I can only follow up so many times before I need to put a stop to it and then just say, okay, this is the cutoff date. So at some point I said, there were a couple of others that came in then I would say a week later to say, oh, I'd like to still participate. And I said, look, I'm sorry, it'll have to be for next year. Just because at some point I needed to start processing the data. So that's what we started. It took me probably about a week and a half to really clean up all of the data. And then it was about a week or so to start first analyzing the data. And then it took probably another week and a half to put all of the data really together in a format and to kind of come up with what you see here today, as well as the internal report that was sent out to all of the companies. So I think what's interesting to know is that out of the companies, almost 2,000, they employ almost 2,000 people here in Greece. Some of them also employ internationally. So many of these companies are also international employers. But you would have seen which companies they were. We'll pass them in just a second again. But of the amount, just over 600 the employee data points were submitted. So I would say we had 600 jobs that were submitted for this particular report. Some of them of companies that obviously have many, many, many more technology positions and others that have less technology positions. What's also important to know is that there were companies of different sizes. So what I mean with that, also different stages of funding. So some were at, let's say, a seed stage of funding. Others were already in their Series C of funding. So there were different stages there. One of the things that I tried to look at as well is to see if there was a difference in the compensation between those who were past their Series A and those who were at seed stage or Series A. And actually there was very little to no difference within that. So I think that may be surprising for some. So some of the things that we picked up on were that, startups are becoming an attractive employer for talented individuals. That's in comparison to the big corporates here. And some of the studies and results I found there, they are paying pretty competitive salaries. So I think that, that's a very positive thing to note and something that's great to showcase as well to new graduates or people trying to change maybe their jobs that, startups are really attractive employers. The second piece is on the equity. So if we compare equity to, let's say, equity in Europe to equity in the US, a lot more companies actually provide equity to their employees versus what you see European companies doing with their employees. And there's two reasons for that. One is that equity is generally taxed much higher in Europe. So if you think about a country like Germany, you pay about 25% taxes on your equity. At the same time, equity is also something that employees are just not as familiar with in Europe. I think that also has to do a little bit with the cultural background, in my opinion, and in some research that I saw, that in the US, it's very much built on the American dream and the possibility of a particular success, which is often tied to money. So there's much more the idea of getting behind a startup and believing in the dream and going for it, and therefore taking on also the risk of the equity, whatever that risk may be. Whereas, looking at, again, a country like Germany, for example, it's much more about security. What do I get every month in my pocket? So it's just a very different way of thinking. Although we do see very much so an uptick in the equity, particularly also in Europe. And I found it even surprising, that we would see 40% of the roles that we surveyed. So out of those 600, 40% actually received equity, which I think, in my opinion, is a positive trend. Why also? Because equity is taxed much lower here in Greece. And I think therefore it can also be quite an opportunity, particularly for startups. And that's one thing that we do see in our results, is that the compensation that we see here is still not competitive enough often when we compare to certain other geographies. It might not be that we still would be able to attract that type of talent that we may want to get with these salaries. And so then equity can become maybe a more interesting part of that compensation package, particularly looking at, that when we see that it's taxed at a much lower percentage versus other European countries. So one other thing that I think that's very important, we'll talk about a little bit further down as well, is obviously the diversity and inclusion pieces on gender disparity, and that we see, generally in tech positions and in the tech world, we see that there's a big disparity between female and male positions. So globally, we would see that is approximately 80 to 20%. So in Greece, we're not so far off of that, being at 82 and 18%, with at least the results of this survey, right? So not so far off that. Having said that, there are things that we can definitely do as companies that can make it more attractive for females to want to join the companies and be in tech positions. And one of those things is to have females in leadership positions. And there we are pretty far behind with having only 3% of females in leadership positions for tech roles. So that's definitely a big opportunity that we can, try to gain. Beyond that, one of my reasons for bringing out this survey, and it was also to show people that if you work together, you can probably accomplish a lot more than if you're trying to do one thing on your own. And I think that also kind of, fits with the idea of that if we want to change things, maybe not just in our own organization, but if we want to change things in a bigger sense. So perhaps, how can we help universities make it more attractive for females to join engineering roles? And then after they graduate from those engineering roles, to also get an engineering position. Those are things that would be very beneficial to us as companies, because we can then hire them into our companies, of course. Even though they may not have a ton of experience or years of experience, ultimately what we see even with graduates is, that they catch on pretty quickly, and often, particularly in engineering roles, they already have quite a lot of I would say operational experience, because they often are doing this also next to their studies. So they're often coding already in projects on GitHub and whatnot, to kind of further their own experience in what they also really enjoy doing. So looking at the data here, we'll scroll down a bit. So basically what we've presented here are the lower range and then the higher range. We looked at the 10th and the 90th percentile. And the reason we did that was mostly so that we could kind of cut out some outliers. Not also, I think it helps a little bit with the messaging of that. If one of the ranges would start extremely low, that people may think like, wow, there's a company that pays that low. And I think that's just the wrong message to give. So it's not something that I would want to share in that sense. Having said that, we shared then also the median for each of the roles, and further down, you would have seen, I'm just going to scroll through it for a bit, I'll come back up. But here you would have seen that we share the averages as well as the median for each of the roles, but also each level. So let me explain a little bit how we went about doing that. So each of the companies was asked to fill out a form, an Excel form, that they would classify each position with one of these job families. And that way we could make sure that we could segregate them quite well. From there on, they were also asked things like, what track is this? So, are they an individual contributor that they have no managerial responsibilities, or is this a managerial track? Beyond that, we also looked at the different levels, and because levels are very different per company, what I did was I identified 5 levels, and I described each of those levels so that they could then allocate the right level for each of the jobs that they were submitting. So we'd start off with an entry level, very little to no experience in the position. We go up to developing, advanced, expert, and executive. So executive being someone who leads one or more departments, somebody who has managing big budgets, somebody who's really looking at the vision and strategy of those departments. So it was really between these ones. One question that I get sometimes is, why did you not put years of experience? For those of you who may have read one of my earlier blog posts, I don't believe that years of experience necessarily equates the seniority of that person. And I'll explain a little bit why as well. And we saw this also in the data. So I saw people with 15 plus years of experience at a developing stage. I saw people with 6 years of experience at an expert level. So, and the reason why I think the years of experience don't always equate the seniority is that what you see a lot, and particularly you see this with people who don't change their jobs a lot, is that we saw a lot of stagnation within that role. So we also don't see that people who necessarily have 10 plus years of experience would earn more than somebody who has, let's say, 7 years of experience. So therefore, I didn't want to add, I have asked to fill out, what was the experience, or how many years of experience did this person have? And that was interesting to kind of see that what I'd written before about that, you should not focus on years of experience, but rather dictating what exactly that experience is, showed that seniority level does not equate with the amount of years of experience. Having said that, of course, it's not that you would see somebody with, let's say, 2 years of experience at an expert or executive level. That's also not the case. Any questions so far? No? Okay, then we'll just continue. So going back to then the actual graph itself. So this is how we then ended up here, as you could see, with each of the different levels, so that you'd have a data scientist at a developing level IC, which means the individual contributor, or an advanced level, which is a level above that, or that's an advanced manager level. Now, the best way, we also looked at the average. The average I would always be a bit careful with. The reason being is that the average also includes really outliers, or weighs more heavily on outliers. But I think, considering I'm talking to a group of finance people, I probably don't need to explain the detail of that. But the median, definitely when you're setting your compensation strategy, go off of the median, right? And for those of you that want to be competitive in the market, you will likely need to be somewhat further above on the median. So if you're seeing that, what we saw in the report, for example, in the detailed report that we submitted to the companies who participated, we would outline exactly what was the lower end of the salary, what was the maximum of the salary, what was the median, what was the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. And that way, they could set their strategy to say, okay, we want to be really competitive. And if you want to be competitive, you should likely be above the 75th percentile. Or if they said we'd like to be, fair and on markets, then you'd be paying at the 50th percentile. And of course, for those companies, said, look, we cannot really pay at market rates, then they know, okay, we're probably around the 25th percentile, or maybe we're going to find something in between the 25th and the 50th percentile. But those percentiles help to understand better, where do we currently sit? And also it helps us to kind of understand, okay, if we want to set a compensation strategy, then we know now that for each of these levels and these positions, we need to be at this amount, starting at this amount for those bands. Any questions on that in particular? No, okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
sorry, can I ask you something?
Yes,
Mike?
of course.
Yeah, the amounts are the cost to the company or the annual gross that the employee is.
Yeah, the annual gross. Yeah,
the annual
correct.
gross is not cost to the company, because
No.
the cost of the company is over that. Yeah?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the best way to compare it, I think, on an international playing field right now as well. The reason being is that most of the reports are annual gross salary. So then we could compare it, but we always know that the cost to company for us would be higher, right? Similarly in any other geography that we would be working with, where they would also have an additional cost on top of that. But to be competitive for the employee, it's important for us to know what the gross annual amount is, so that from there, each employee could also calculate what for them the net amount would be. So for example, based on different factors, it could be that your net amount is higher than somebody else's net amount, or it could be that the net amount that you get in Greece could be lower than the net amount you might be making in, let's say, Spain. And this way we can get a better calculation, because that's what you're actually giving the person in their, let's say that's what you're stating in their contract on the gross amount. So it would be a better compensation, or it'd be better to compare it that way than having to try to calculate everything back. Here in Greece, we talk a lot about the net amount and in 14 salaries. But if we only know the net amount, it's much more difficult and we don't maybe know if it's actually 14 salaries being paid. It might be much more difficult for us to go back to what the gross amount is and then make that international comparison. So this is why we're sticking with the annual gross amount. Yeah.
Okay.
Zane, another comment from me is if it would be possible in the future to make some sort of benchmark with other European Union countries, like, as you said, Spain or Poland, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yes. So that's the goal as well, right? So while I was starting with this, this is kind of, I would say, a first stage out of another stage. The next thing is to try and see how can we compare this with other countries. The difficulty with that, and I mean, this is also perhaps where I can call upon companies to help out again as well, is that most of the compensation, so some of the geographies definitely have compensation reports. If we think about the UK, if we think about Germany, if we think about the Netherlands, there's compensation reports that we can get there that are, let's say, free of charge. But there are other countries where it might be more difficult to get that kind of compensation data. So often then you have to pay for that data, which is not cheap. So we'll do our best to kind of see how we can make potentially a comparison with what we see here, because that would be interesting. And again, the comparison, it's quite a big feat, because we cannot only just look at okay, it's not apples to apples, right? If we're comparing, for example, the compensation here with that in London, for example, or with Munich in Germany, or Berlin in Germany, or Amsterdam, or the big, let's say, tech hubs in Europe,
You need to
then
take consideration of the cost of living, you mean?
exactly, yes. Now, when we think about the current status here in Athens, with rent prices going up and whatnot, we are not very competitive with Berlin, I can tell you that. But we are still somewhat competitive with a city like Munich, for example. So I do think that, what we need to do is, we don't necessarily need to be paying the highest salaries, but we need to find a sweet spot where people say, hey, I'd love to work for a Greek company, I'd love to work here in Greece. And, this is kind of like the basic income that I would need to have to work with that. And that's something that I think, if we can figure that out, so that we can figure out that, people do not get shocked by the salary, so to speak, but are more like, okay, that seems fair. Cost of living is somewhat lower. And, then I think we can be much more convincing in getting people to work for us here. In addition, we have the big resignation happening now, and it just really shows that people are not joining companies anymore for, what they're getting in their pockets, as long as it's something that allows them to live their life comfortably as they do today, but that they're looking for other things as well. And I think that's something that we need to kind of figure out for ourselves. Is that something that we could provide more so? And I think, Greece has been obviously exploring that a lot more and trying to attract, let's say, nomads and whatnot. But I think we can probably do an even better job at that, and figuring out, what are really the things that we need to kind of work on, that we can work on, that likely would not impact, let's say, that would likely not impact our budgets as much. So we can think about things like, what's the company culture like? There's many Greeks that I speak to overseas that say, yeah, but I don't want to work for a very hierarchical company where this and that. So if that's something they're looking for, then how can we prove that? And how can we ensure that we create a culture where that's not the case? So these are, I think, are things that we can think about more so with you all, but also with your companies, with your HR departments, to figure out better, okay, what are the other things beyond just salary that we can make it attractive for people to come and work for us?
Zane, another question for me is, have you seen any examples of a significantly discounted salary in exchange for equity? Like something like someone, receiving,
No.
I don't know, 50% of their salary and having options and share options and so on. No.
No, I would not say so, but I will say that I've seen salaries at, let's say, a 50, like at around a median, and then given equity on top of that.
Okay.
And I think, that's also where you can try to make that more competitive. But there's one thing that we definitely need to do. We need to talk more about equity. We need to talk more about how that could be attractive, and what that could mean. And the problem is, of course, as well, that, in order for that to happen, we also need to have more exits happening. So if we can see more exits happening, then people can also hear those stories and know what could actually come out of that. So yeah, let's all work towards some good exits. But yeah, I think that, definitely there's just needs to be a lot more education around that. And then I think it could be a tool to help to elevate the compensation. Yeah. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. Talking about the equity and benefits. So with equity itself, I talked about this already a bit. And as we just mentioned, I think that definitely there is an opportunity there. Not everybody's happy with equity. There means that there's also more operational costs in actually making sure that all gets distributed, and that it's not just promised, but it's also actually executed. And I understand that there's an overhead there, but you know, at the same time, we also need to understand, okay, what if we cannot pay top salaries, then what is it that we can make that overall compensation package more attractive? Now, to no surprise of anyone, I would assume, you know, most of the leadership positions receive equity. What I think is good to understand here is that the leadership roles included anything from a director level and up. So that also included, director levels, VPs, as well as C-level. Now, the leadership positions were actually very interesting. You know, they ranged anywhere from, I would say, 15K per year up to 50K or 170 or almost 200K per year. And the reason being is that what we clearly see is that, you know, founders are paying themselves a very minimal salary and putting everything back into the company. And you see that more at earlier stages than that you see that at later stage companies, where at later stage companies, you see that, you know, clearly the C-level is getting paid and founders are getting paid more, upwards of the 100K. So one thing that is, you know, interesting to see, and I don't know the exact reasoning behind it, is, for example, that to see that the data science is quite low, or is at around 20%, whereas some of the other engineering roles are very much higher. Also on product and design, for example, being much higher. So I found that interesting to see that that was actually quite a bit lower, but I have no explanation for that, at least not from the data. Location-wise, so one thing that I unfortunately did not ask for is whether the position was remote or not, and I will certainly make sure to do that in the next survey. And I think this is why we also see that the majority of the positions currently are based in Athens. Mind you also that most of the companies that we surveyed in here are based in Athens. So I think that it's not an uncommon feat to see that, you know, the majority of the roles are here. There is some, of course, in Thessaloniki and in Patras that we see as well. But yeah, it's quite insignificant to what we see in Athens. Mind you, of course, that, you know, of course, the ratio of people in Athens compared to Thessaloniki is also 4 times. So of course, we would see a higher figure naturally. But nevertheless, I think that we might see this change over time as well, as we will see more, in my opinion, more positions become remote. I think that, you know, companies are going to warm up to the idea that they likely need to hire more remote roles as well, because they're going to not be able to find the talent, and particularly in tech roles, that's often not too difficult you know, it's not so difficult to work remote in a tech role versus perhaps some other roles that may be harder to fill remotely. Gender we talked about before. Again, the one interesting thing was, and I think that's obviously something where, you know, it's also, I talked about it before, that DE&I, so diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge topic at the moment globally, particularly in the US. There's new laws that say that companies need to report more and more on their DE&I, and that they're an inclusive, prove that they're an inclusive company, diverse company. In Europe, we don't have that as such type of legislation. However, you know, we are also seeing that more efforts are being put into DE&I. The interesting thing was that I asked all the companies, you know, to provide me with the gender, and the gender that I asked for was male, female. But I also said that, you know, if you have, or it was very interesting to see that the only genders that were noted, so to speak, were male and female. Now, of course, in many cases, people would say, well, those are the only genders, but as some of you may also know, I'm sure you're aware, you know, we have huge discussions on having having a third gender or having a gender that is not identified as male or female. And so I think therefore, I think nobody was able to identify that, likely because nobody has identified themselves like that in the company as well. And again, I think that has a lot to do with also our culture here, that, you know, it's not something that we probably state very publicly or openly, at least not yet. But there are quite a few companies where we do see that that is changing, so that we do see that not just male and female are registered. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, I don't think that will change much in the next survey, but, you know, who knows, in a few years' time, we'll see that might change as well. So we talked a little bit about, obviously, the roles. Again, you know, product design and QA testing is much more heavy female. It's not really a surprise that the engineering roles are much lower in having much less female roles. Mostly because many of the design and the testing are not super technical roles. So somebody who is in QA or in testing doesn't necessarily need to have a technical background. And the same goes for design, or at least not a technical background, meaning in software engineering. And the same goes for design. Maybe interesting to know as well that, you know, I saw research that said that out of all of the, so when you look at graduates from a university, often 20% of those graduates from a software engineering degree are female, and of those females, only for another 40% or so don't actually even end up in a software engineering role. So imagine what the actual amount is that does end up in a software engineering role, and we can clearly see it here. You know, that disparity is pretty big. The one thing that I do want to focus on really is the leadership position. You know, the leadership one is, I would say, the one where I think we all need to fight the hardest for, and that has to do not just for the fact of you need to have a female in your leadership team, absolutely not, but you need to also understand why. And there's enough research that indicates that, you know, adding different genders, or having a mix of genders and having a diverse leadership team, brings also more innovation. It brings more thought and views. And so therefore, you know, you are not just focused on one particular, let's say, road, but you understand that there's a broader view in itself. Today, interestingly enough, I was seeing that many of the e-commerce platforms, which are often focused on females, you know, it's mostly women from a particular age group also that go to big e-commerce platforms. So think of your e-shops, any fashion e-shops or homeware e-shops or whatnot, where it's mostly women that are shopping for this, but the investors are often and the management teams are often male. So if you don't bring a female perspective into it, you know, how can you ensure that you are addressing your target audience in the right way as well? Of course, you can do that through surveying, whatnot. But I think that, you know, again, proving leadership, adding that leadership to having that diversity in the leadership team is extremely important. It's also important because it attracts others to join the company as well. You know, they have a role model, they have somebody that they say, oh, that's somebody that I could become. So I think it's very important to have that diversity. Great. So kind of coming up to the last part of this, obviously, and then again, ask me more detailed questions on what you're curious about or what you'd like to know. But basically, you know, we're saying that this is an initial platform for all startups to get an understanding of what are kind of the baselines that they are paying or that they probably should be paying, that it helps them to start, really thinking about their compensation strategy. You know, it's not something that's always top of mind for startups. But it is important for them to also attract the right talent, and that means compensation is obviously a big part of that. So for many of you that did not participate in this round, it would be great to see you participate, of course, in the next round. So we'll be open to share when that will be. It will likely be mid next year. so that we can launch it somewhere in Q3. Any particular questions?
I actually have one. It's more on the latest, on the gender thing. It's not that much on the benefits. It's do you feel that if you expand your research to other more business roles, finance, etc., especially in the startups in Greece, do you feel that these percentages will change? This is totally unrelated to benefits, though, just because we discussed the gender thing right now. And of course, I'm a female. And well, it's discouraging a bit to see these percentages, but I know that a new generation is coming and these are going to change eventually.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, right? But if we don't do anything, it's also not going to change. So I think that, so I will answer your question as well. I do think there's a lot more that we need to do and that companies need to do from even a, I would say even a, from internally. So, you know, what are we doing to show that these types of roles can also be female roles? So, for example, Lego is doing that fantastically now by making sure that, you know, there's not anymore very gender focused Lego, so to speak. You can no longer, I believe, on their website even scroll or select for boys or for girls, so to speak. So it's even in just the products that we create, but it's also really about the language that we use. So, you know, there are tools like Textio that you can use to understand, is this job description very focused on a particular gender or is it not? So there are certain words that are more relatable to certain genders versus others. And those are all small things that we can do internally, right? Other things that we can do but what we also need to think about is not just what we do internally, because it's not just going to grow by nothing, right? There needs to be quite a big change done by companies, and I think also culturally, that will ensure that more females go into tech roles. It's not going to just happen. So I think it also means with us working with universities, and maybe even as low as high school or even before that, to kind of talk about the perhaps engineering roles, why that's exciting for girls to attend as well, what makes it attractive for them to join that, so that we can really start from that age already to kind of showcase, hey, have you ever thought about it? Because if I would ask most of the women on this call, you know, when you were in primary school or in high school, did you ever think about going into an engineering degree? And some of you may have done that, but it never even crossed my mind, to be honest. So I think that, you know, I was just not exposed enough to that. And I think that kind of exposure is something that we as companies can do more so of as well, by simply doing even things like presentations in high schools, talking about that, or in universities more so that we can really, stimulate that kind of growth. To come to your question, it will be significantly different for other areas of the business, hugely so. And I can tell you that, you know, there are other roles that are much more women heavy, so much more heavy by females than by males. So, for example, if you think about call center positions, there's a huge, you know, I would say disparity there, where you see that it's much more heavy for females to join a call center position, so teleperformance, versus males. And there's also good reasons for that. So one of the reasons, for example, is that, you know, women are still often the ones who are staying home with the children, or who need to find a part-time job, or, you know, who need to have that kind of flexibility, for example, or who need to be able to work from home. And this is a role that often offers that kind of option. So again, you know, if you're looking at yourself as a company, if you're looking to attract or make perhaps your disparity less, if you have a lot of men in your tech team and not a lot of women, and you're trying to attract them more, you could think about things like offering part-time roles or offering more remote time or things like that. So there's definitely also disparities in other roles where it's more female heavy versus male heavy. Yeah.
I have another question from Marios. that's gonna watch this video as well, but I think we don't have this kind of data. He's asking if we have data on the average or median of the stock option percentage per role. And also if we did any research on advisors. I understand advisors is out of scope.
Yeah.
But
No,
I
so
wonder on the percentage stock option plan awarded per role.
yeah, no, we didn't do that. The only thing we asked is whether equity was granted or was not granted for that role. So it was a yes or no answer. And the reason being that it was very difficult for us to really quantify equity. Now we could do a percentage, but even then, you know, it's hard to still put it, to quantify it and to say, okay, how much is that really? And that could be diluted as well. So so this is why we only said to say yes or no and not to actually include the equity at this point in time.
Dilution is actually definitely an option, but the way that you could take dilution out of the equation might be if you ask a percentage of the pool. So
Yeah.
if we ask just how much, like a 5%, not of the
Yeah.
company, but of the pool, of the
Yeah.
option pool.
Yeah.
So we could see, you know, where is, maybe you didn't have to share all this data, but maybe just share, you know, which roles are more equity heavy, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely the more senior roles are more equity heavy, I would say. And what you see is that certain companies provide everybody with equity and others provide no one with equity. So yeah, but we don't have any percentages at this point in time.
Are there so
for that.
many companies providing everyone with equity?
There are a few, yeah.
A huge hassle, I can tell you.
Sure, but you know, there's so many things that are huge hassle, right? And I think that there are, I mean, if you compare it to other companies, you need to somehow make yourself more attractive. And particularly if you are a company that's looking to not just be in the Greek market, but if you're looking to venture out in the US market, you know, equity is something that is likely to be asked by any employee that's going to join you.
Elena, your question about the hassle was because of issuing and canceling the equity, or explaining it to the people?
Everything, especially when it comes to companies that are not listed. This this is even worse of a nightmare most of the times, and it starts with explaining, not with a triggering event. But I think that it deserves a whole event. This discussion, this debate might deserve a whole event on its own.
Yeah, likely. Probably we can talk a lot about that. But you know, I think for myself, I mean, of course, I understand that there's a lot of work to it. But at the same time, if you as a company, for example, want to become more competitive in your compensation, education is something we can do, right? And there was actually a really interesting, I had a nice discussion with somebody else the other day where I said, look, what you can also do is offer the following. If you make an offer, that you don't just make one offer, but that you make 2 or 3 offers. And the offer that you make is one, either just only a cash compensation, or 2, which let's say is at, let's say we put it at 65% of that band. Or 2, you could do a cash plus equity compensation, where you would put the cash amount at, let's say, 60%, and then add a equity compensation that you equate to something that's a little bit above the total amount of 65%. Or you could say you go much more heavy on the equity and you would put something at, let's say, 50% in cash, and then you would have a much heavier equity amount on top of that. And that way you would give the candidate a choice, one of those 3, to choose whichever one they would want to have. Now, again, you may say, well, that's a lot of administration, but I think, you know,
you are asking them to play their income on a bet. To this, I have a debate.
No, so
yes, but these 3 options as well.
Yeah, sure. And we can have that debate. No, I think it's you first, you give them a choice. So they feel they have a choice. And I'm not asking them to place a bet on anything, because I'm just saying that, you're joining my company. I assume that when you join the company, you also believe in what we go for, that you believe that this is going to be a success. Otherwise, I would never join a company that I think is not going to become a success. Then you're better off not joining the company. So I do think that there is already you're already at a stage that you believe that company is going to be successful. However, for example, if you really need to, let's say, make X amount because you have home loans or I don't know, whatever, and therefore you cannot take any risk, or you cannot have a later an amount at a later stage, but you need that every month, then you go for the security of taking, okay, a lower overall in compensation, but you take just a cash compensation. But if you don't have anything of that, and you feel like, I think this company is going to be a success, we're going to do great, of course, then you can choose to take part in the equity as well.
That's interesting, providing the three options. I would be very curious to see that in action and see who goes for the third one. Yeah, it would probably be the people on the more high-paying roles, of course, that can afford to do to have a discount on their salary. Yeah.
Likely, yeah. But again, what I want to make sure that is clear is that you cannot offer somebody, let's say, 500 euros a month as their net salary and then put a huge equity piece on top of it. That's not what I mean to say with that. What I'm saying is that the equity helps become more competitive. So you should start your lowest salary that you're paying in cash at the median or somewhere higher than the median if you want to be competitive in the market. And then on top of that, you would put the equity to make it more competitive.
Okay. I have a question with regards to this whole effort that you made. So my question is, I wonder, was there any role that surprised you? Any data point that took you by surprise, that impressed you?
Yeah. Well, I think what I found obviously surprising was how low some of the founders really compensated themselves. I think that 15K per year, that's pretty low. So I think that was quite, and that's gross, right? So that's not your net. So I think that was for me quite a really low compensation, something that I've not ever seen before in any other market. I would say in other markets where, of course, compensation is somewhat higher, it's also lower, but I would say it would be more around 40K or so per month versus 40K per year versus 15 per year. So I found that very surprising. I think some of the other things that are nice surprises is the fact that some of the IC roles, so the individual contributor roles, are being paid higher than the managerial roles. Now that can be because maybe in this survey there were more managers at the beginning stages of that level or so. But nevertheless, I think what we see more happening, and thankfully we see that happening more here as well, is that companies are really thinking about two tracks within the company. So one, an individual contributor track, and one at the manager track. And that companies are no longer just valuing more, putting a higher value to the managerial track versus the individual contributor track. So that means that somebody who is at, let's say, at an expert level as a manager, that they receive the same compensation as an expert level individual contributor. Or the same goes for a developing manager, would have the same compensation as an individual contributor manager. And I think that's a really positive trend that we're seeing also here. Other than that, just looking at the roles, I mean, there were some roles clearly that, paid very low, below 1,000, I would say ultimately below 1,000 gross per month. So yeah, there were some very, very low salaries. And again, what I said, what was also really surprising was to see some people with 10, 15 plus years of experience in rather the lower levels versus the higher levels. And I think that has a lot to do with the mobility. So meaning, you know, how much have those people moved, first of all, within their own company, but secondly, also perhaps to other companies. And I think that this is something that, you know, particularly when you think about the fact that obviously we're in a massive economical crisis, that people were not so open to just changing roles and jobs very quickly. So when you had a stable job, you would keep that stable job. At the same time, you know, I have these discussions a lot with my husband, who's an engineer himself. And, you know, he says as well, you know, sometimes I'm not sure that even friends of his who are developers here, that they always understand the market and what their value in that market really is. And that they stay within a job because that's what they know, but they don't go and explore outside of that. You know, I had a discussion with one of the HR managers last week of one of the companies that participated, and they had mentioned as well to me saying that, yeah, I was talking to an engineer and they did, and I said, oh, you don't have a LinkedIn profile, like, and he said, no, you know, I was getting messages every day from recruiters. I couldn't keep up in answering them, so I decided to just delete it. So, you know, again, it showed that there was not really probably the idea or the thought of wanting to change jobs, and at the same time, not really perhaps understanding what that could mean for them with so many recruiters reaching out to them. And you must understand that our engineers in tech, most of them, if they have a LinkedIn profile, they will likely get a message at least once a week, if not once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day from recruiters.